Welcome, everybody, to the February edition of our Land and Wildlife Speaker Series. I am really excited about our guest today. I'm Luke Macaulay. I'm the Wildlife Management Specialist for University of Maryland Extension. I do a lot of work on all different types of wildlife, but I work with a lot of farmers who are dealing with deer damage. But one of my big passions is improving wildlife habitat for all sorts of wildlife species. Game species are obviously a big focus, and that is what we'll be talking a lot about today. It would do us a huge favor if you would subscribe to the YouTube channel. It helps to expand the reach and of where all this stuff goes to and reach a broader audience. If you ever want to see some of our past recordings, they're all up on the YouTube channel. We have topics ranging from how to manage your yard for less mowing and more wildlife, deer management from Kip Adams with National Deer Association, beavers, frogs, all different types of wildlife. So definitely check that out if you find any topics of wildlife that you'd like to dig into. Next month's speaker will be yours truly. I'm going to be sharing some of our work out at Point Pleasant Farm, where we've been deploying acoustic monitors and tracking bird abundances and diversity using these recording devices. We now have about 2 years of data, and I'm really excited to share the findings that we've had just in the last 2 years from some of the habitat work we've been implementing. This chart on the right gives you a little sneak peek of what we'll be going through, but you can see the height of those bars on the x-axis is the date. And so we started back in 2024. You can see the improvement in the number of bird calls over in 2025 summer with that big peak over here on the right. So we're excited. I think this is a good indication that our habitat improvement work is working. And I'm really excited to go dive into this data with everybody next month. But more importantly, for today, I'm excited to have Derrick Dixon. He is the founder and principal of Whitetail Research. And he came onto the scene about 6 months ago, maybe it's 9 months ago now, where he posted a YouTube video that went completely viral about unlocking the secrets of mature bucks with thermal drones. And he has been flying thermal drones, I say, for days at a time, for hours and hours at a time, tracking bucks, and has just great, very fine scale understanding of how bucks are moving during the day using his drone. So I saw him and I immediately contacted him. I was like, I've got to talk to Derrick. This is really neat, because I'd fly a thermal drone myself, and it was really interesting to exchange notes with him. Derrick grew up in Missouri. He lives in southern Missouri in the Ozarks, and has a really interesting story. He doesn't come from a traditional wildlife background. He was a tech coordinator for a local school in Missouri, and he was obviously a very passionate deer hunter. And he decided to make his passion into his job and started really diving into collecting data on mature bucks and tracking that, and just launched his Whitetail Research last year, and has just had phenomenal growth on his YouTube channel. And people just, I think, really love your videos, Derrick. So I'm really excited about discussing all this stuff with you today, and I think our audience is going to like it too.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Today, and we're going to basically run through some of the core aspects of mature buck management. And we'll start with one of Derrick's really cool things that I've found is his insights into thermal wind patterns and how important those are for deer behavior. So we'll dive into thermals, then we'll talk about bedding cover, food resources, and then at the end, how do you tie all this stuff together into a hunting strategy for trying to target certain mature bucks on your property. So
Yeah.
Derrick, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, Luke. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we can start with some of the thermal stuff.
Mhm.
It was not, I have always known that wind is super important for deer, but I always just assumed. I looked at the weather station and I saw, the wind's coming out of the north, so my scent is going to be blowing down to the south. But I think when I started watching your channel, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm not even keyed in at all. I know about thermals, but I haven't thought of them impacting my scent on the ground, on the topography on the ground. So do you want to just give a kind of a brief introduction of like how'd you get into thermals? How'd you key in on this topic?
Yeah, well, the initial thing was a lot of kind of core hunter beliefs leading way back when. It had to do with mature bucks bedding on the leeward side of the ridge. Not just mature bucks, but deer in general. If you just asked anybody, where do deer bed in hill country? It's like, well, if you just drew out the leeward ridge on every portion of your property for your predominant wind, then that's going to be where most of your deer are going to be bedded. And it's like, okay, that's a pretty simple answer. And going into my research, I didn't have a lot of initial points that I was trying to seek out. There were some kind of micro level things that I wanted to look at, but initially it was really find the mature bucks, track the mature bucks, and just log as much data as I possibly can going into it. And one of the things that I noticed really quickly was that mature bucks were not utilizing wind to their advantage and betting on the leeward side as much as people thought they were. And there were many instances where they're utilizing these thermal hubs or micro train features where they're not on the leeward side of the ridge, but technically maybe they are, but they're it's not an obvious thing that you could see on a topographical map. It would be more so something you'd have to go in person and walk onto it and go, okay, this is how they're utilizing this little section. And then the more I also started looking at, once again, wind, I was paying attention to winds so frequently initially. Deer weren't utilizing wind to their advantage when walking hardly at all. Sometimes they would move downwind of a bedding area or downwind of a feeding area before moving into it. Other times they didn't. And there was no rhyme or reason. There was no frequency that it was like, yeah, 80% of the time they were doing this. It was just very evenly split across the board. And it's like, okay, what's actually happening here? Because wind does not seem to be a predominant factor in most of these instances. There are some scenarios where it was, like maybe the wind was 25 to 45 miles per hour that day. Like, okay, they react to that. Maybe they're going to hunker down a little bit harder on that day. But for really subtle winds or kind of even getting into like a 10 mile per hour wind to 15 miles per hour, it seemed like most of it was being predominated by thermals. So I started really focusing on what's happening to the scent molecules in this hill country terrain. Why are they walking on the upper third or the lower third of the ridges whenever they're moving through these areas? Yeah, that's kind of what keyed me in on thermals initially. And then another thing that I noticed was throughout that first year that I was tracking deer, I was logging around 160 to 180 data points per day per deer that I was researching. And I was noticing in the evening they were always standing, whenever you're out in the woods, the best way to explain it is like if you're out in the woods and it's late evening and there's a lot of kind of noise and racket that's happening all evening long, and then all of a sudden everything just dies and it kind of coolness starts to settle in, the sun is dropped, and all of the audible noise, just everything goes down and drops significantly. That time frame was whenever all of the deer, mature bucks specifically, were getting up on their feet every single time. And I also kind of correlated it back to, if you look at the weather app and you just look at the temperature for that day, if you draw out where it's going to peak for that day, so if temp peaks at 65 and it immediately drops off to 63 the next hour, in 10 to 15 minutes of that peak temperature, all the mature bucks were standing up on their feet. And that doesn't mean they were standing up on their feet and moving out to feeding areas or actually doing anything at that moment. They more so they were just getting up and kind of preening around on their body, cleaning themselves, maybe walking around and hitting a rub here or a scrape here within a small 100-yard circle. And then as evening settled and more and darkness started to come in, then they would move out further and they would head off to a feeding area or head off to a bedding area to kind of scent check does or something to that nature. So there was definitely something happening that was beyond just wind taking place. And that's kind of where I keyed in on thermals way more than anything else.
Interesting, interesting. So let's back up even a little bit more on the importance of scent, maybe for those who aren't thinking about that as much. And I will reference a great podcast that Dale Rollins did on scent and how dogs are able to detect scent of birds and point birds when you can't see them, obviously. And he had a guest on where he basically described scent molecules. There are certain scent molecules that are heavier and some that are lighter. And so a dog is even able to detect as the scent molecules move with wind, some will fall out and onto the ground earlier, others will drift even further away. So it described how a bird dog knows how close it is to an animal based on the molecules it's picking up from that bird, which kind of blew my mind to think about like how they could detect distance from the type of scent they're picking up. So, and I would say deer probably have similar olfactory abilities, maybe not quite as good as canines, but certainly very strong ability to smell. And it's probably more important for them than visual or even ear, like audio senses.
Yeah, it's definitely a debatable subject on which one is actually better utilizing scent. But and another thing to that with dogs that you see with tracking dogs for tracking whether it's deer or any other type of game is oftentimes a really well trained dog. They can ID whether or not the animal at the end of this blood trail is dead or not. And that's been proven multiple times where they'll be scent checking a deer or they'll be on a track for a deer for a blood trail and the dog will just stop. They'll be trained to stop if that deer at the end of the trail is alive. And most of the time they're correct in that. And it's really fascinating that they're able to dissect that as well. And I've even seen that with coyotes where they're able to get onto a scent track of a wounded buck and they kind of come in a little bit curious as to what he's doing, and then they move in on him and try to see how weak he is. They'll kind of nip at his heels and just kind of try to get at him and see if he's going to be able to fight back. And oh, okay, he is able to fight back. So let's back out. And they'll back out and leave the area, go gather more coyotes, and they'll just kind of stay around him and monitor him that entire time. But I'd have to think that whenever they picked up his scent initially, they knew that he was just wounded in general. He was still
Yeah.
alive. So they were like the scouts going out before everything else to make sure like how well is he actually handling himself at the moment. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
pretty
And that
interesting.
follows with bird dogs as well. And this came up during that podcast where they said, you don't see your bird dogs pointing on a dead bird. So they can obviously they just know to retrieve it. They don't think it's alive. They can tell it's dead, probably from the scent as well. Cool. So yeah, so we've got the importance of scent is out there and you're noticing these thermal impacts. How much do you think audio and maybe something you just would opine on, you mentioned it gets quieter. How much does that also give them more security, you think, in these scenarios?
No, it definitely could. And I think the last time me and you talked here recently, and you were mentioning something about wind and how you were correlating it to wind noise. I don't remember exactly.
Wind
Oh,
speed, yeah.
yeah,
Activity of deer in soybean fields
yeah,
decreases
yeah, with
with
the soybean.
increasing wind speed. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we kind of made the theory off of that related to bedding. I know if people don't know what I'm talking about right now. We'll get into it at some point. But I definitely think there's something to that. No, that 100% that um they're going to start utilizing the problem with them in their hearing is a lot of times whenever I'm out hunting, like say you have a buck and he's 30 yards away from you, if his head's down and his big old cone ears are aiming the ground, you could sit there and almost have a conversation with the guy 5 yards away from you in another tree. But the moment that he picks up on something and he turns and he flicks one of his ears while he's down and it aims it in your direction, he can hear a pin needle drop right next to you. So their hearing is really good, but it's extremely directional. So sometimes I wonder how well they're able to utilize their hearing. I know whenever you watch them, like say whenever they're bedding, oftentimes they'll bed with their ears aimed in different directions. Like one will be aimed forward and they can flip the other one to aim somewhat backwards. So that way they can hear in multiple directions. And likewise, whenever, say, you wound one or you shoot at one or you spook one, if you pay attention, you watch a deer whenever it runs away from you, a lot of times we're looking at its tail flagging at us. But
Mhm.
if you pay attention to its ears specifically, it'll flip one ear one direction and it'll flip the other ear in another direction. So that way it can start picking up where that predator actually is and where it came from. So they
Yeah.
utilize their ears and their big cones in a certain direction
Right.
to pick up on sound. So moral of the story though is if they're not kind of in an aware state and they just have their ears plumped forward, their hearing ability is not that great if they're just listening to the ground. So yeah.
Right. Right. Cool. So maybe when we've talked before, and I was trying to wrap my head around this thermal aspect, and I know we talked a little bit about. I don't know if you want to describe how thermals work and the general morning patterns and evening patterns that you can see. And you already mentioned that sort of peak of temperature, and about right after that peaks, about an hour afterwards, is a sort of settling that happens. And I guess that coincides with the thermal switch that we'll talk about a little bit.
Yeah, no, and I can pull up my little graphic here. Let me get my mic out of the way, and we can start looking at a little bit of it.
So this was something for me. It took a long time for my brain to wrap around it because I'm kind of slow. But it was pretty neat to see to really get a handle on when are these wind patterns changing and how are they impacted by topography. And topography is also a key part of this as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, the most important part, I mean, to say before I even get into this, is if you think about, especially during hunting season, as this applies to somebody that's hunting, and in my mindset, is that the sun is predominantly, and especially in hill country, it's going to be hitting south facing slopes. So anything that's north facing, and in this example, we can say that this is. Boy, that was a beautiful end. I'm drawing with my finger on a touchpad, so just
So
don't judge it too much. So that's north facing, and that's south facing. We'll call that an S. I'll do better. I can do better than that. There we go. Um, in this essence, if the sun is up and if it's midday at the angle that the sun's going to be, then only that section over here is going to be getting hit by the sun. And in order for thermals to be activated, the ground has to be heated, and obviously it has to receive sunlight. So in this specific setting that I've drawn out, this area would be getting hit with sun. Therefore, any scent molecules and just the air itself is going to be rising. But this area, this massive cavernous location, is cold. So all of this air is going to be dropping that entire time. And it's going to kind of act like, if you've done any research in this, you'll hear some guys refer to as the bathtub effect. And it's because cool air is heavy. So it's going to fall down into the bottom and it acts very similarly to water. And one of the weird effects that'll take place is whenever all of this air is dropping and it kind of pulls up in this bathtub, some of it, like, if you just poured water into a bathtub, some of it will go out beyond the edges. And whenever it does that, cold air displaces warm air. So whenever the cold air displaces this warm air, it kind of shoves it up and down at this little portion here. And whenever it shoves the warm air up, that warm air starts going up and swirling. And oftentimes it gets caught back in the cool air section again. And then it'll come back down and it'll repeat. And it just creates this big circular effect in these valleys where scent is circling from the top of one ridge on the north side all the way down to the bottom on the south facing section. And that's why oftentimes you'll find deer position themselves at the upper third and at the lower third in bedding areas. So, from a hunting perspective, you have to find a way to utilize that to your advantage, knowing that these deer are going to be essentially capturing all of the scent from this entire area. And that doesn't even factor in if you have a ridge here and then this section has thermals that are rising. And that also doesn't factor in whenever you introduce wind into the equation. This was as if there was no wind, the first explanation that I did. So if you implemented wind into the equation and then now it's blowing this warm air over, then some of that warm air could potentially drop itself back down and get caught into that cool effect as well whenever it enters this giant swirling pool of scent that takes place. And that's where kind of the terminology thermal hubs comes from at some point. And it's pretty fascinating. There's a whole nother portion about inversion layers as well that kind of caps off where there's warm air that's capping everything below it. Getting into inversion layers with my drawing abilities is kind of a difficult thing. So I'm not even going to attempt it at the moment. But
Right.
maybe if that made sense to you, Luke.
Yeah, no, inversion layers are really definitely an interesting thing. And I, just for the audience, I know they come up a lot with if you're doing prescribed burning, inversion layers are really important because they basically can trap all the smoke underneath a cap of air. And so you want to make sure you don't have inversion layers when you're doing certain activities like burning or even certain types of herbicide use where you'll trap volatilized herbicide and it stays in the ground. It can spread to crops in the area. So great. So that's a good introduction. Let's maybe dive in a little bit into, so now interacting this basic pattern of wind patterns and thermals with bedding, and dive into bedding. Uh, Maybe we can talk. So bedding is obviously a really important strategy for hunting because then you know where the buck's starting from at night, or going back to in the evening. So how do people, and of course they've got excellent ability to smell you and see you and hear you. They're placing themselves in a sort of undetectable spot.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find out where these spots are on the landscape? Of course, thermal drones help a lot, but if you don't have a thermal drone, what are some strategies just on in general how people have used it before we had this type of technology to reveal these things?
Yeah, no, I mean, boots on the ground is kind of the hunting reference that a lot of guys like to say, but really, you kind of have to get in tune a little bit more with what's taking place on the property and being able to identify bedding locations. But there's definitely some forms of habitat that there's so many bedding locations across that expanse. Like say, just a continuous, monotonous patch of timber that's like 1,000 acres straight. Finding a bedding area in that where there's hardly any habitat diversity is really tough because deer, they don't reutilize that same exact bed every single time in that setting. So they're bedding all across the landscape and it becomes really difficult. But if you're in a setting where you actually have a little bit of habitat diversity, oftentimes the deer are going to be bedded where there's less human presence, very significant key on that. And not less human presence, that's the wrong term. More so, human presence does not enter their exact, they can be right next to human presence, but they really like to position themselves in bedding areas where human presence never enters that exact area. So you could have housing taking place all right next to their bedding area within 200 yards of it. But if they never step foot in that patch of timber, deer will utilize that to their advantage. But more often than not, in almost every form of habitat that I've flown, habitat diversity seems to be the number one thing. If there's an edge, some sort of edge, maybe a savanna styled habitat or something to that nature, can be a native old standing field, something to that, they will utilize that edge and bed right on it as long as it's not directly visible by humans.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've seen on some of the crop fields that we worked on here at the Y Research Station, there was an area of the field which it had a corner. There was a farm building 500 yards away, but it had lights on at night, and they would literally only use the corner where the line of sight. There was this almost a line where they were just completely eating all the soybeans, where that line of sight from the buildings at night was
Hmm.
not casting into that field. So they, even at night, in the middle of the night, they can detect like line of sight to buildings and things like that where they knew they could kind of be more protected. Yeah. Cool. So you've got, if you've got so that's a good argument for having more habitat diversity on the landscape, and something that obviously you have more habitat types, you have more different wildlife types too, and improved biodiversity. So there's other benefits to it from a broader wildlife perspective. So it also sounds like it's also a deer hunting benefit to having some diversity. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I mean diversity. A lot of times, wherever that diversity is, from a hunting perspective at least, the deer will utilize that to their advantage, kind of as a visual cue for whenever they're traveling from point A to point B. Because if you're just walking, think about it from your own perspective. If you're just walking through monotonous timber, you don't really know where you're at. As a certain, if you don't have a map or you know your phone or anything to that nature, or a compass, that was the word I was looking for, a compass. I haven't used a compass in so long as I just use my phone. Anyways, if you don't have anything on you and you're just walking through the woods, then you have no idea where you are from point A to point B. So they're utilizing these habitat edges as visual cues, and then it kind of re-engineers their brain like, oh, okay, this is where I'm at. And they'll do that as well with cliff edges and sharp steep drops and things like that, where whenever they see it, it's almost like it re-engineers in their brain. It's like, oh, okay, this is where I'm located, and they can continue to move off of
Yeah. Well, this sounds a little bit like your conversation with
Dan Infalt.
yeah, Dan talked about how there would be a tree in a open sort of marsh setting, or more of a swamp setting, and that seems like deer trails always sort of center in on like an individual tree and a
Yeah,
sparse trees in a landscape.
yeah.
They were using maybe these as markers for where to go.
Hmm.
Cool. So they've got some habitat diversity, and then so at the landscape scale. So then, if you're pulling up a map, like you can then find edges and start to think probably thick cover would probably be something that they'd be keying in on as well, and potentially certain sides of slopes. But it sounds like maybe not always the leeward side of a slope.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on what's being offered to them. Like I can pull this that property up that we've been
Yeah.
talking about, and we
Yeah.
can
So
just
yeah.
analyze
So
it.
yeah, Derek, we thought it would be useful to actually see this stuff on the ground with a some satellite imagery and describe some of these concepts. And so we're working on a property here that we can use an example and think through some of these topics.
Yeah.
Um, great. So yeah, we have some topography maps here. We have
Mhm.
property boundaries. And go ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to be mainly looking at this section that's encapsulated by the white boundary, and I'm going to turn off the public land portion. Just remember that where this creek runs through, anything to the south of it, inside of my white boundary, is pretty much public land.
Yeah.
That's We'll leave it at that. But I like turning off that blue layer so I can
Yes, I can
a
see it.
little bit see a little bit clearer. And one of the first things that you'll notice when looking at this is there's a lot of human activity taking place. You have residential, these little 5 acre lots, 10 acre lots of people living all the way throughout it. There's road access all around this entire area. And then there's actually, this is a piece of public, but it has trails all throughout it for people to go and jog or walk or bike or anything to that nature. And then likewise over here, there's another big patch of public, and it all has trails intersecting through it as well, allowing for human activity. So there's a ton of human activity taking place around this giant block that I have marked in white. And that in turn is going to mean that most of the deer activity is going to take place inside of this white section. Deer will move up, and they'll, dependent upon how active these people are in their home or on their property, if they walk down to the creek every single evening, there's probably not going to be a lot of deer bedding on that point. Whereas if there was zero activity, that's kind of like a telltale, that oxbow there is kind of a telltale sign, like deer would love to bed on those. But that's something that's highly dependent upon how active they are. But even if they are still walking into their backyard in this setting, deer will utilize this habitat edge down here very frequently. Even then, this, I know I'm outside of the white boundary by the ways, but I just keep seeing things, and it draws attention to me. This little
Yeah.
feature here, this topographical feature, that's kind of one of the things that I was mentioning. That's not a You're not on the leeward side anymore. In fact, that would be, for a northwest predominant wind, that would be a terrible location. But what they'll do is they'll move into these areas. I keep having to move you around everywhere, and they'll just bed right on the inside of this drainage, right up at the top. And technically, they're on the leeward side of this little drainage here. But if you were to just pull out
This
on
is
your map,
assuming a north wind and a wind coming from
yeah,
the north.
yeah, it's assuming a predominant northwest wind. But normally, if you just pulled up your map and you wanted to look out for all of these northwest, leeward sides of ridges, that area would never stick out to you in a million years. You would never look at that and go, "That is a predominant leeward side of the ridge." You're going to be looking at everything over here, and never back into this a type of micro feature like that. So that's an easy example for that. But in terms of just looking at this property and guessing where all of these deer are going to be bedding and hanging out and spending a lot of their time, a lot of it is going to be taking place in this little patch here. It's kind of a thermal hub. There's a lot of water activity as well, and it's far removed from human activity. There's probably not many people accessing it. There is a public parking spot here, so that way you can access the public land. And I don't know how deep, I don't know how intricate the trails go in, I don't know how often people are walking it, but I would assume once you make it into this stuff next to the creek, it looks pretty nasty and pretty thick and hairy. I think a lot of human activity is or a lot of deer activity is going to take place in that area. And from there, from a hunting perspective, you can start breaking down how you can utilize potentially thermals to your advantage, or in this essence, you would probably be utilizing heavier winds to your advantage more than anything, because whenever you implement a body of water into a hunting situation, if you can blow your scent out over the water and into the water in a cool area, if it's cloudy that day, then the water will just take it. The water will just run your scent away from you. And you don't have to worry about your scent at that point, unless the deer can cross the water. And then at that point, they could pick up your scent when they're crossing it. But this creek looks pretty wide throughout portions of it. So I would assume that you'd be safe in a lot of that.
Right. And an analogy I think that you spoke with me, you've mentioned it once before, is thinking about air as water.
Yeah.
And it really just helps to cement in my mind of this air sort of draining down this topography and down on top of the water, but in a very similar pattern. And while thermals are cooling.
Yeah, yeah, while they're cooling, and then if you were to attempt to utilize this to your advantage, I think that you'd messaged me about this property, and you said that it would be predominant, a little bit better for evening hunting, and it would be if you could get up high on these little points here, and everything is south facing on this piece of private land, so it's all south facing, so you're going to be receiving a lot of sunlight, and in turn, you're going to have a lot of access to be undetected, but if I was hunting this property, the number one thing that I would be doing is trying to find a way where these deer are crossing right next to the highway around the creek. And I don't know where that point is, just from here on a map. But if we were to say all of the deer, they just have a beat down trail right here across the creek or right over here, then I would be finding a way to get set up right next to that on the right side of it, and I would hunt it on a west wind where my scent is blowing down the creek in the direction that they can't cross, literally looking for areas where it is impassable for the deer. And I don't care about thermals at that point. I don't care about anything other than the wind speed being a little bit faster than 5 miles per hour. So that way it's somewhat steady and that it's coming out of the west. And if I have a west wind, I can sit right next to where they travel. And then I would wait until there's a heavy amount of public presence, kind of pay attention to how often people hunt this. And whenever people start moving in and hunting this area, going and sitting at this transition point where they wrap around the creek, all of these deer are going to get bumped out because these guys, they're going to have to walk right into their bedding area to attempt to hunt them. The deer are going to get bumped out. They're going to wrap this edge of the creek and they're going to try to bed down right in this area. So you're going to be able to intersect all of those deer getting bumped out every single time, early in the morning or late in the evening, dependent upon human activity that takes place on this public land, which could be difficult to figure out. But that is the number one spot to hunt in this area. Probably the number two spot is a lot of times from a hunting perspective, you're looking for funnels. And that's where I just created a funnel there by finding where they like to travel through. But another really good funnel in this setting is right over here on the edge, all the way next to it. There's actually looks like a mobile home is right there. And I don't know the human activity that takes place there, but this spot right here is a very tight funnel. It's 72 yards wide. Once again, that area would be really, really beneficial for guys that could hunt it. You'd really want to hunt it kind of up here, less so down here. But with a straight west wind, you could hunt that and have your scent blowing right into the creek, right, whether it goes above the creek or into the creek, I don't care at that point. And you're intersecting any deer that are trying to walk through this really tight funnel here. I don't know what the daylight activity is through there. The other thing is that, do you know, Luke, what what's actually taking place in these open fields?
Currently, it's crop agriculture. It's been corn.
So it's actually
And you can see some of these edges and these corners that were food plots that I think
okay.
we'll go back into food plots.
Yeah, yeah. No, if this area had a kind of early successional habitat or something that was waist high or higher on these low spots here,
Mhm.
as you can see, the train dips away from that housing that takes place up at the top. You're not going to be able to see that from the house, especially if you start having waist high habitat. and a
Yep.
lot of deer would be bedding right in these areas. So if you were doing an agriculture setting, maybe if it was corn specifically, deer would bed out in the corn every once in a while. Oftentimes they still like to stay on the edge. But if you moved it into a little bit more natives, especially down in this corner where it drops off really steep, then a lot of deer are just going to be bedded right on the edge of these fields, which in turn would make it more difficult to hunt. But you'd probably have a lot healthier deer, a lot healthier deer herd, and they would live on you a significant amount more.
Yeah.
And bow
Well,
hunting it would become difficult though.
yeah, one thing I'll point out on those food plots, if you zoom in on that one on the kind of in the middle of your screen, there is a band of switchgrass that's been planted at the
Okay.
top of that to kind of block, I think, as a visual screen to kind of give that security as well. Maybe when the crops have been harvested, so it gives a little bit of protection there.
Hmm.
But so it's just another wrinkle in the current situation, which could help with some of that. But uh,
Yeah, no, and I mean, in terms of this section, there was another reason why I marked that, because this is also public over here. Why I marked this section and this area over here is that this area, there's so many areas where you could blow your scent into the water. I mean, you could sit at the top of this little runoff here. You could sit at the top of this one. You could sit anywhere in here and have it blowing out across into the creek. There's just a lot of opportunity to be undetected whenever you're hunting it. Whereas over here, the terrain doesn't really begin to offer that. There's a lot of semi flat, there's nothing steep, there's no major funnels. There's a patch of timber that runs out behind these houses. I would like to think that a lot of deer will actually be bedded on these corners, once again, dependent upon how active the humans are in those areas. But it looks like there's some farming operations going on there, so they're probably not bebopping down into the woods too often. There is, I would assume, quite a bit of deer activity out on these corners next to homes, and maybe you could utilize that to your advantage when hunting this setting, and find somewhere in between this 440-yard section as a funnel. But if we're just comparing apples to apples, two sections of property right next to one another, right here and right here, this area to the left is far more huntable because there's a little bit of terrain diversity, and I actually think I don't it'd be hard to say that there's more deer living on this, but I think the deer are going to generally congregate towards the creeks. They love, you can see that in any form of ag setting or hill country setting. If there's running water and it's a creek or a river, oftentimes deer will be bedded all around the creek. If you had a drone, you could fly this creek and look at any of these little oxbows or these little areas where it drops off and there's a patch of timber next to it, and there will be deer tucked in all of them, unless there's a road that drives right out to the edge of it, like over here. Then they,
mhm,
they might not be in that setting. But deer
yeah.
just they love that form of habitat.
Yeah. What about that creek on the right-hand side? That there's some topography on that right section
Over
on the
here.
public land. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that looks like you can finally get some topography on this side of the property. So, but it's all timber. So has it become more difficult to tie in onto that?
Yeah, it does become more difficult. At that point, you would have to start looking at train itself. The train itself, once again, is nothing here screams that it's too steep for a deer to walk up and down it. Any of this, they can move up and down. And especially whenever you get into just a wide swath of timber, I mean, they'll walk all over this entire section in that hub. And technically, it is, by the way, that is a kind of micro thermal hub that's taking place there a little bit. You have south facing, and then you have a north facing slope taking place there. Um, yeah, to say that it would still be really tough to hunt. I think there's a lot of deer activity that takes place around this field, though, by the way. So, yeah, I mean, you just stare at it and it's like diversity, diversity. There's
Yep.
diversity all around it taking place. I don't know exactly what they're doing, what program they're doing there because that's a piece of public, but
Yep.
it's definitely working, whatever it is. It looks pretty good in my opinion.
Yeah,
And
having
it's
that, I know there's a big quail initiative over in that area, so I suspect that there's some that's early successional, sort of old fields, and looks pretty shrubby at this point. Looks like maybe 3 or 5 years old,
yeah, it's kind of
so a
getting
lot
to
of
the
cover. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, getting to the tail end of it. But it still looks pretty good.
yeah, cool. So we've got bedding now. Interesting thing now. So you said west winds, and you're only going to drive it down. Would you not utilize thermals rising to because getting down there in a west wind, I guess you could have some of your scent blowing to the east and alerting anything downwind as you get into your stand potentially.
Yeah.
Is that a concern? Or and also, what scenarios would you use when you got thermals rising? Would you not try and take advantage of that situation or south winds?
There's a lot of settings that you could do. And by the way, is this area you could also hunt it with an easterly wind and blow it directly at the highway. I know they're a little bit more rare, but that is something you could do, is move out and set up on the left side of this with an east wind and hunt it. But in terms of hunting with thermals rising, that opens up the world to you, because you can set up, and one of the more important parts about it is that you need to be high in a tree if you're going to be wanting to try to utilize your thermals. Because if you set up on, let's say, this portion, the south side of this food plot, or even this food plot here, and you're on the ground, then there's a chance that, depending upon season, there could be a heavy canopy, and that canopy is not allowing sunlight through it. And in turn, your thermals are just going to swirl down and funnel down to this bottom and blow out this entire section. You would blow out literally everything. Whereas if you could get 15 to 25 foot up in a tree, 25 foot sometimes pretty high for people, but depending on if you're using a saddle or not, you can do it. Then you can get up high enough that you can get back into the sunlight. And whenever you're getting hit by the sunlight, in turn, you're going to be radiating, and thermals will be rising out of your area. And in a setting where you could sit on this point here with the sun hitting you all day long, and you're constantly having thermals rise out of your stand where you're positioned high up in a tree, you could hunt this spot on almost every wind as long as it was steady. You could hunt it on a south wind blowing directly over the food plot, and you could have does walking out inside of it, and your scent's just going to blow right over the top of them. And the risk you run, though, if you're doing something to that nature, is if the wind is suddenly, it's 10, 12 miles per hour, semi steady, and you're blowing your scent over a food plot, and then it just shuts down and it's like 1 mile per hour to 2 miles per hour, then you're screwed at that point. You're gonna blow out the whole food plot. So
Right.
that's definitely a risk that sometimes you'd be willing to take. And also, to answer the question you said earlier about moving down into this area with a west wind, you probably would have some kind of effect over in this area. I would like to think that if it was me, I would be heading to the head of this drainage here, and I would tuck myself down into the drainage. So I'm out of the wind now. And then I would walk right down the drainage all the way to here. At this point, your wind's going to be getting opened up, and it's going to start blowing your scent across. But I don't know, run to your stand from here to there for that 84-yard jaunt. Take a really hard run and make it to your stand and climb up in it. Because I think once you make it to the point that you're blowing at the creek, it really, and also for what it's worth with this stand location, you'd really be hunting these deer that are down on the public land portion that are getting bumped around you. So a lot of these deer to the right, you're kind of expectant to, you might blow a couple of them out, you might not. And for what it's worth, I also think that a lot of the mature buck bedding activity that takes place on this section of the property that you would be blowing your scent towards is going to be right in here. I think a lot of it's going to take place right there. That big bow that takes place there. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, I can't explain why. It screams mature buck to me whenever I look at that. Same thing with this portion over here, this little kind of oxbow here. I
Right.
like that. I like that area as well for a mature buck
Hmm.
versus back over where the water is not so deep. I don't think that they're going to be bedded here near as often as they will back over here. That's kind of a hard thing to explain, other than the fact that when I look at it, I just feel like that's where they would be.
Yeah, I feel like, well, when I look at it, when you said that, is like it's like a large expanse of an area that humans just will not, in their right mind, go through.
Yeah,
Right. And
exactly.
it's just too swampy and gnarly.
Mhm.
Cool. And so, and just to explain to folks, you would walk down that drainage because you're expecting your scent's going to land on the ground and drain out along the waterway rather than kind of blowing over the top of the hill.
Yeah, so if you're walking down the drainage in the morning and everything is cool at that point, sun's not up, sun's not heating essentially anything, then all of your scent, if you can get into that drainage, is just gonna run down the drainage all the way to the creek. It's gonna follow your footsteps as actually it'll lead your footsteps in a lot of that case. And once it makes it down here, it might kind of swirl out and get hit by the west wind and blow across. And like I said earlier, you might start blowing some stuff out here, but I don't think it's going to carry far enough to the areas that I truly care about. Finding that exact area where they cross, that was crucial, because if you set up too far to the left of where they're crossing, and then your deer move in, then you're just going to blow everything out every time down there.
Right. Now, now that's a morning scenario. In say it's a warm, an afternoon scenario and you got the sun shining.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Do we,
sunshine helps you because, I mean, all of these south facing slopes, really wherever you're wanting to set up on, so long as you can get there, then you're going to be really effective. The only problem you would run into, and this kind of goes back to educating people more so on where the sun is in the morning. If we're kind of looking from where the sun's going to rise in the morning, this little ridge here is going to be getting pounded by the sun, and the sun's going to come up and it's going to rise. It's going to wrap to the south, And now this entire bowl where I talked about mature bucks liking to be, it's getting hammered by the sun now. But as we go into the evening, like what you're mentioning, now this section that was hit by the morning sun, it's not getting hit anymore. So this section right here would start falling. And if you were hunting it with, like, say you wanted to sit here with a north wind and you're hunting high in the evening, a little bit higher on this ridge, kind of near the trees, and you even got up 15 foot, if that sun goes away and it quits landing on you, and you have a north wind and you think that your thermals are blowing out over this large expanse and just into the air, it's dissipating up above all of the deer that are there, and you don't receive sunlight anymore late at evening, that last 30 minutes of sunlight, of shooting light, then there's a chance thermals are going to start flipping where you're located, and that north wind is just going to blow, and you're going to blow out this entire area within a matter of seconds. So understanding that you don't need to be set up there for the evening, and there is a chance that you could get high enough that you could continue to receive sunlight, but in the chance that you wouldn't be able to in the evening, you'd want to be kind of further on this side somewhere. So that way, whenever the sun is dropped, you're still receiving it all the way until the end of shooting light. And like a lot of us know, with especially if you're trying to hunt a mature buck, a lot of their activities are going to take place at that last 30 minutes of sunlight. So it's kind of a crucial time period. And it's also a time period where a lot of thermals are flipping and changing and swirling. And that kind of makes for a reason as to why they like to move at that time frame, because there's a lot of activity taking place. And also, like we said, the audible cues is potentially a reason as well. So yeah, finding ways to set up. But really, I mean, you can implement that same strategy all the way across this south facing band. Hunting it in the morning, in the middle of the day is very possible all the way across the board. But that late evening setting up in an area where you're going to continue to receive the sunlight all the way until the end, yeah, is really important. And then another thing is, if you have environmental conditions that come in and start disturbing it, you go in and you set up in this area, like say you've hunted this spot in the past, and you know for a fact that you get hit by this, you're high enough and you're just getting hit by the sun the whole time. Thermals are rising out. There's no leaves on the trees, so you're not having to deal with the leaves capping off where your scent's blowing. It's perfect. And there's 45 minutes left to go in the evening, and cloud cover moves in rapidly. Do you stay in? Do you continue to hunt, or do you climb out of your tree and you run back to your house? I would probably climb out of my tree and run back to the house. If it was me,
Wow.
if you had a north wind and you were trying to hunt that situation with the way that you thought it, and then the environmental change happened, and now thermals are just going to start dropping, which in that instance, they would start swirling for quite a while before they would actually drop. But yeah, no, I'd be terrified. I'd run back to my cabin. I wouldn't keep hunting in that
Want to
setting.
blow all your bucks out of the area.
Yeah.
Yeah, fun. So how about, okay, here's a question. How do box blinds, how, I don't know if you've experienced much with this. Sounds like you're oftentimes in a tree stand and more out in the exposed area, but enclosed box blinds, how much I have noticed that certainly reduces how much of my scent's getting out. But even if I have one window open, I have noticed as my scent is leaking out onto the ground, and I can drop milkweed or whatever sort of scents, and it'll float and land on the ground. And I've noticed as deer are walking underneath me, for example, as soon as I land where that milkweed's sitting on the ground, they pick up on me and will take off. But yeah, do you have thoughts on how,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
No,
impact?
yeah, I have more experience than you think. A lot of the guys where I grew up from, they all hunted out of blinds and towers and things of that nature. And the first thing that I would say about your blind is, what kind of blind are you hunting out of? Are you hunting out of a soft shell kind of pop up blind, or are you hunting out of a enclosed DIY built blind that you sealed every corner in the entire thing? There's a lot of fancier blinds out now that have rubber gaskets in them and stuff. But like, for reference, I could use this property as an example. Say I wanted to hunt in the bottom here, and I wanted to hunt right next to his bedding, but I didn't want to get smelled. So I actually did this on my property, where I had a bottom. It was creek bottom. It was actually moving same direction as this. It was a dry creek though, but I wanted to be able to sit in the bottom, and I'd never been able to, because everything's just swirling constantly and there's no way to hunt it. But there's a great reason why mature bucks are moving through there, and it's just because of that. It's impossible to sit there without being blown out. So I built a box blind out of timber. I timber framed the thing, and then I used 3/4 inch plywood for the walls, and I don't know how many tubes of caulking on that thing, but probably 25 to 30. I used a ton. And then I put rubber matting inside of it, and also I made it as quiet as possible. I sealed the door up really well. And I mean, it was very purposeful built. And then I elevated it, I think only 4 foot to 6 foot off the ground on telephone poles, and put it down in the creek bottom, just very similar to this setting. And I could sit in that blind on any wind, any conditions. It did not matter. And I could have deer walk within 3 yards of me. Right. I mean, they would literally walk out of the creek right next to the tower, and I could just sit there and watch them, and I would never blow them out. So that's a situation where, yeah, a box blind can definitely work, but I was a lunatic and I utilized, 30 tubes of caulking to ensure that none of my scent is going to leave that area. And I built the windows very, very well. I had them sealing up against garage door, those garage door rubber tab sealers.
Yeah.
I had them shoved into those so that way they're retaining all my scent there. I kept all of the windows closed constantly. So, yeah, there's a lot of variables that go into how effective a box blind can be. But if you build one well enough, moral of the story, you can 100% seal off your scent. Another idea that I've
How about
tested,
then? How do you open? Well, then you have the problem of how do you open the window
yeah,
and without learning
you
everything?
so yeah, once again, it depends on how well your blind is built. One, you only open the window whenever you're about to shoot. So if you're not about to pull the trigger, or say for me, like a photographer, and you're not about to try to take a picture of something, then you don't open the window at all. You just sit there and keep it closed with even with 10 deer in the field. Some things can become situational where maybe you have a mature buck running in and you need to open it really quickly versus waiting. But in terms of opening it, build your windows well enough so that way they're quiet. And one of the ways I did that, actually, I used a little 1/2 inch PVC and I
Mhm.
put a washer behind it, and then I screwed it in right next to where the window closed. So the window would close and I would just rotate that piece of PVC on the washer. And it was very silent connection. So you could just twist two pieces of PVC and it would pop the window open for you. The only thing you would have to do is right as you made it in the tower. See, these are all things you have to pre-think though, is whenever you leave your windows connected to these gaskets for so long, then and you don't open them for say
They
a
stick.
month, yeah, they stick. So
Yes.
the first thing you do when you get to your tower is you open
Yep.
all of your windows and then you shut your
Yep.
windows back. So that way, whenever you open them for the first time, they're not going to stick and go pop whenever you're trying to shoot a deer. So yeah, there's a lot of little variables that you have to think about, but really it's heavily dependent upon what kind of blind are we talking about. Because if it's a soft shell blind, you're not going to retain hardly any scent. It will, to a sense, disturb the way that your scent's going to leave your blind, but it might not help you as much as you think. One thing that I have done though, and I've tested and it kind of worked, was we took a redneck blind, is what it was. A lot of guys probably know what those are. Just a hard shell blind. I put a I put a hot stove inside of it, and I put a hot stove pipe that ran straight out the roof all the way to the, like, I think it was 25 foot out the roof. So that way all of my scent that was inside of the redneck blind versus maybe it seeping out into nature and dropping down below me, it was going into this vent that was going 25 foot above me out of the redneck blind, and then from there it would vent out my scent 25 foot high, and by then it's getting hit by the sunlight of that particular layer is rising. So yeah, you're undetectable at that point as well. So I haven't done
Did you
that
have
on a
any
soft.
fan, or was it naturally, you think, exhausting from your body heat up? Or did you
Yeah, I
have
think,
something?
yeah. So you could utilize a fan, but I had it naturally exhausting from my
Mhm.
body heat up. That was the thinking, and it worked. By the way, it 100%
Cool.
worked. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Now, have you slept in your blind before? Like, do you go in the evening and sleep in there so you have access in the morning without having to move?
yeah. I haven't, but well, I take it back. I have in the past, but most of the times I sleep in a blind and then I get up and I move to the tree that I want to hunt out of because I
Yeah.
just prefer, personally, I prefer to hunt out of a tree. Oftentimes, whenever I stay in a blind, I'm doing photography because staying in a blind, one, it allows you to use your tripod because you're not going to carry your big, heavy tripod up into a tree. But two, it allows a lot of hand movements below. And that's kind of why I prefer blinds whenever I'm doing photography.
Yeah. Cool. Oh, Phil asked, I just noticed. Thank you, Phil, for asking on the chat. He said, have you noticed, can you relate this to the Eastern Shore where there's no topography? And we do, well, this is actually an Eastern Shore property, but yeah, some properties don't have much drainage, and they're pretty
Hmm.
flat. One we've talked about before that I'm working on at Point Pleasant Farm, yeah, I think 3 feet is a lot of topography there. So
Yeah.
that's what we call an Eastern Shore mountain.
Yeah. Well, that's actually something that's still undiscovered at the moment. I was talking to Dan Infalt here recently in my more recent podcast, and he said to me that, and I haven't flown tidal marshes, I haven't flown any high, super flat terrain intermixed with cattails and things like that yet, which is kind of what you can find on tidal marshes out east. But he told me that he can walk up to this one particular property that is all straight 100% marsh. It's not out east, it's north, but still. He can walk up to it and he can tell you exactly where deer are going to be bedded on it every single time. And it's just because he's been there so many times that he knows where those deer like to frequent, and he's never been able to piece as to why they go back to those exact areas every single time. They're not in really close proximity to something. They're not utilizing wind to their advantage, it doesn't appear. So there almost has to be something to the really long sloping terrain where yeah, maybe there's only a 5 foot elevation change from across 1,000 yards, but they're still utilizing thermals potentially in that advantage in that session. But I don't know. That's something that I can't answer to. I think the more important thing that I would look at if I was hunting out east on like a tidal property is I would wait for those tidal shifts to take place, and that in itself is going to cut off areas and also allow areas to be traveled inversely. For whenever if titles are high, in turn, then terrain is going to get shoved up, and you're going to be looking at it, different areas where you're only able to travel. Which I know they walk through the water. And there's a lot of guys out east that have shown me pictures of deer with mud all the way up, on their upper legs, but oftentimes they're not going to swim across a long expansive water space of water unless they have to, like say I know that there's a famous deer in Missouri one time that swam across the Missouri River. They will do that every once in a while whenever they have to, but if they can, they kind of like to try to stay as high as possible.
Yeah.
And utilizing tidal shifts to your advantage, I think, is a really big thing out east, and it would be, in my opinion. I don't know, someone could
Right.
probably correct me on that.
Well, I will say, like, the tidal effects. This is an interesting thing because I used to live in California, and the tidal effects. If you look at the tidal charts out in certain parts of the country, depending where you are, the low tide will be multiple feet. It'll be like, you can have a negative tide or whatever, like 2.5, 3 feet, sometimes more. Here on the Eastern Shore, I've noticed a lot of times it's very minimal. It's maybe a foot, 6 inches. So you're not having a huge impact. I think you can always just pull up your local tide chart for people who are thinking about this and see how big is the tidal effect. It could still lead to maybe a certain area being a little bit, not as wet as others. So maybe there could be an effect there to think about. Yeah. Mark also asked, he said, have you noticed mature bucks utilizing this during the rut? Are they sort of following these same patterns, you mentioned a thermal tunnel or these thermal hubs,
Yeah.
or did their behavior
Well,
change?
yeah, so often whenever I'm asked kind of the hierarchy of what the importance level for mature buck bedding and kind of mentality, number one is always doe and estrus. So if there is a doe and estrus, then mature bucks will often do something outside of the realm of, they'll just do something stupid. And sometimes what that is they'll shove a doe into a proper area, into a really dense, heavily covered location that makes a ton of sense, and he'll lock down with her for a day in some cases, and then he'll breed her and move on. And in some instances, he can't move her out to that area because she's been getting shoved and bounced and around by younger bucks the entire time, that he has to move into a really terrible, really open location to be locked down with her and kind of try to protect her off of things. So yeah, no, in the rut, a lot of times I say that you just kind of can throw a lot of it out the window. And but the biggest thing that changes the behavior of deer, in my opinion, during that rut time frame is if you have an area that's completely undisturbed, 1,000 acres, never receives human or hunting pressure, then deer will be all over that place. There's not a location on that 1,000 acres that they will not step foot on at some point. But the moment that you insert human presence into the equation, then that's the thing that'll start deterring and shifting where mature bucks will spend their time. Say you have 1,000 acre property and it receives really heavy hunting pressure all the way across it, and most of the times that heavy hunting pressure is going to take places in areas that are easily accessible throughout the property, then deer in turn are going to get shoved further and further down in a way into more remote locations. And that will that will affect the way that they spend their daytime activity. And a lot of times that's where people start coming up with the terminology nocturnal bucks. And my buck, he just on camera, he's only active at nighttime. And it's like, yeah, he's only active in that open area that you're trying to hunt at nighttime due to the hunting pressure. But they're still highly, highly active back in bedding locations. And there's a lot of most breeding activity on most pieces of land that receive a decent amount of hunting pressure takes place back in bedding areas. There's does are kind of cutting and running all throughout these thick bedding areas, and the mature buck is tending her and sticking with her that entire time. And younger satellite bucks, 2 to 3, sometimes 4 or 5 bucks, are off, 50 to 100 yards, observing the event taking place and kind of maybe waiting for an opportunity to try to slip in, but more so that it almost seems like they're sitting back like in an educational experience, like let's see what actually shakes out here and maybe we can
Or
bump into and
heuristic
try to fight. Yeah, like they're sitting there trying to learn about something. So
in the rut, and it basically means like all bets could be off depending on where
yeah,
the doe's at.
yeah,
Yeah.
it heavily depends on hunting pressure, and then also yeah,
Yeah.
when your does are entering estrus.
I got one more question, but I want us to touch on habitat and food resources. Especially, we talked a little bit earlier about native sort of old fields, what we call early successional vegetation communities versus crop fields, or even say cool season food plots like clover fields that are a little bit more open. And we had some interesting conversations. How what are some of the highlights of what you've seen in terms of deer utilizing kind of what you would call a grassland? Or I really don't, in some ways I call it grasslands misnomers, because I really think the benefit is having high levels of forbs, wildflowers, and a lot of diversity. So some grass, but not all grass, because there's a lot
Mhm.
more food resources in a wildflower field than in a grass field. So let's say it's a diverse kind of wildflower field with interspersed grasses, some shrubs and blackberries and things like that growing, and how that compares to a cool season food plot, say clovers, and then you have a soybean field or a corn field adjacent or something like that,
Yeah.
or just in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah. In my area, it seems like those particular fields that I'll call them old fields, they they're the most popular places of any location. And if you're adjacent to a soybean field, then that soybean field will still draw a lot of attention late in the evening, especially in southern Missouri, because a soybean field's extremely rare. But they're still spending predominantly most of their time back in those old fields, and they do a ton of browsing out in them. Now, if you flip the equation, you take away a soybean field, and you just have man-made summer food plots, or maybe the guy did a clear cut here, and it's 8 years old standing, it's kind of losing its value a little bit more, but you have some of these old fields surrounding that property where this guy's doing a lot of heavy management. Then I'm seeing a ton of deer activity out in those native fields in the summertime. And this season we had it was a really bad drought season. In the food plots that we put in, I think I put in 30 acres of food plots on this small 750-acre portion of property. But across the board, I have access to 3,000 acres, and there's more food plots all the way across the area. I don't know, maybe over 50 acres. And the deer activity in the food plots, which are actually they're very high quality appearing food plots, is minimal compared to these native old fields. The old fields are pulling all of the bedding, and they're also pulling over 90% of the browsing, probably over
Mhm.
80%. I hate to put a percentage to it because I haven't
Right.
actually looked at it, but a heavy amount of the browsing pressure is taking place in these native old fields. And that goes all the way to like right now, like in the middle of February, I don't know what it is, late February, heavy amount of pressure taking place out in those fields. And I think the most important thing for those native fields to allow for the act, which if you want daytime activity in them, I guess, because at nighttime it doesn't matter. It's actually kind of crazy to fly a drone at nighttime in some of these areas where there's a lot of homes and stuff taking place, where there's these heavy intermixed native fields all over. Because at nighttime it's just like you just took paint and splattered it on the map with white hot spots all over. Because deer, they'll walk on the road. Obviously, we know that because we hit them. They're everywhere at nighttime. But as
Mhm.
daytime starts to come up, then they shrink back a little bit further into the areas that are less visible by the road or by somebody's house. And there's just it's a they are the most popular location in my area without a doubt.
Right. When you mentioned the food plots being avoided, I'm curious, are there brassicas in there?
There are. Yeah, there's
Have you noticed that brassicas, I've planted brassicas, turnips, radishes, and multiple places, and the deer didn't touch them.
yeah.
And I've mentioned this to other people, and they say, well, sometimes it takes them a year or 2 to learn them.
Mhm.
I wonder if there's a learning behavior involved with the before they feed on them, if maybe that's part of the avoidance at this point.
Yeah, I've heard of the learning behavior idea, but another thing that I've seen, which is kind of the inverse of that, it's interesting, is on my property, we plant brassicas, we have turnips, I think I have daikon radishes in there, and a couple others. They all get eaten on my property, and
Mhm.
oftentimes it seems like, with brassicas, a lot of times they say whenever the first frost hits, then it becomes sweeter, and in turn unlocks it, and deer realize they need to go and eat it because it's the best thing on the food or on the food chart at that point. But on my farm, that seems to be true. If you go a mile away to the ag property that I research on that has soybeans, they have corn, they have all these really great crops. In the late season, kind of whenever we first plant our brassicas and going into like September and October, and they start to come out, and we still have old standing beans, like a field of 40 acres of old standing beans. And this is pre-frost. Like they've never been frosted or anything, but they're standing almost knee high, maybe mid shin high. Deer will be 50 deer plus will be out on those brassica food plots just pounding them on
Hmm,
that property. They don't
hmm.
wait until the frost. They seem
Right.
to be like addicted to them immediately. It's like, oh, that's green, I'm going to eat that.
Yeah.
And I've never put together why a mile away they'll just hammer them as soon as they start to come up. Whereas, you go back to my property, they wait until, sometimes I've seen them wait until January before they hit turnips, and
Yep.
all of a sudden you walk into a field and it's like every turnip's been flipped out of the ground. And
Right.
like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So yeah, no,
Yeah, it
I,
is.
I haven't I haven't put a reason to it.
Yeah, and I think I have looked up like nutritional characteristics of brassicas with frost, and I don't think that there's anything detectable in like vegetation samples between after a frost or before frost. So I think some of that might be a kind of a guess, but I also wonder if some of it is for certain deer, it's not preferred until there's nothing really left. And they're going after everything else, and those brassicas are the last thing there. And it definitely is an edible carbohydrate or edible vegetation, and they're going after it kind of late
Mhm.
season. Is kind of one thing I've thought about too.
Yeah.
But anyway, so well, this is a so I do, as you know, and everybody, most of the people who know me, we do a lot of work on bobwhite quail. So it's always cool to hear quail habitat as a potential sort of maybe a low maintenance food plot. Early successional fields or old fields can be, relatively easy to maintain. There's herbicide and fire and other things that you have to do, but not as much, no fertilizer, maybe some, some of the no tillage, a lot of things like this. So you don't have to worry about as much. So I like to think about them as a kind of a low maintenance food plot that sounds like from your experience could really provide a lot of food resources.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other thing that I want to talk about, if you want me to go into it, on the sometimes they're here and sometimes they're here thing
Yeah.
related to the natives
Yeah.
and the food plots. One thing that I've observed, and I haven't talked about it anywhere else to date, but I mentioned it to Luke the other day, was that in the food plots, some mornings I'll take up and I'll fly, and 100% of the deer, or 95+% of the deer that are out browsing, they'll be in these food plots. And this isn't like a 100-acre section I'm studying. This is across 3,000 acres, tons of deer, hundreds of deer at this point, that are all out in man-made food sources at that point on that morning. And then the next morning I'll fly, and all of the deer will be back out in the native fields, and they're all browsing. And this is very consistent across this 3,000 acre span. I've looked at it on other properties as well that are in southern Missouri, and it just seems like there's a green light for food plots one day, and then it's like nope, nope, red light for food plots and green light for native food plots, and something is causing them to prefer one over the other. And one of the initial things I started looking at was frosting. I thought that potentially there was a connection with, if it was a frosted morning or really heavy dew or something, then they would be out in the native field over the food plot. And I know that's something that's been observed with cattle before. Sometimes they prefer or not prefer something that's been frosted, but at the same time, even though they have the same kind of stomach, if a cow eats acorns, they die. Whereas it's kind of like with the whitetails thing, they love acorns, so they're not the same animal, but still, it was a connection point I was trying to piece together, and there was no connection to it. They some frosted or dewy mornings they were out in the natives, some they were out in the food plots. And then one thing that you'd brought up, the that maybe there was a connection to wind, and that's something that I'm
Mhm.
going to start looking at more. But it makes a lot of sense that if you introduce a heavy amount of wind and you're in a native food source, then that louder audible just kind of wisp of everything that's taking place, then they want to be kind of tucked back in that cover. Whereas if there's less wind and it's very, I forget exactly what it was that you said. Now my
Yeah,
brain's
no,
getting.
yeah, we
Yeah.
had cameras. We had cameras out on, I think, 10 or 15 cameras out on a soybean field, and we noticed a significant effect of course, night and day. So they prefer being out in night, and then wind was the other significant variable in terms of every mile an hour increase in wind speed. We had 8% less activity in the soybean field. And I would think that soybean fields are a relatively exposed kind of area, so they're out in the open a bit more than if in an early successional field where they're the same color as the vegetation. They blend in, and I've heard other hunters, like people like Kip Adams at National Deer Association and others, say, they'll walk into early successional fields and feel like they're covered, even though it's going up to the shoulder or whatever, but you can still see them. And they're more hesitant to go out into a food plot where it's a bit more manicured, and they can sense something there. And I'll throw in another finding that was really interesting there, and may also play into this, was a lagged effective activity after rainfall that we found. Deer were moving in 36 hours to 48 hours after a rainfall event. Say it was an inch of rain would come, we'd see a statistically significant effect of deer moving into these fields after rain. And we talked a bit about one of my hypotheses is that there's, you water your plant and the next day it's really healthy. And so they're coming in, the leaves have a lot of water content. Maybe there's a tiny bit of fresh growth on them, and they're nipping off all that stuff too. So I wonder if some of those factors would be similar in a food plot as we'd see in the soybean field potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other advantage that we talked about this too is the after rain, I've observed a ton of heightened deer activity directly after rain, and that could be, you could have a rain throughout the middle of the day and it shuts off at 1 p.m., then deer activity just dramatically ramps from that point on. And especially I haven't made a video on this yet, but then the number one thing out of it all that I've observed is mature bucks going back out and refreshing scrapes post
Mm.
op of a rain. And that's been a theory that's existed for a long time. And it's 100% true that mature bucks will seek out their scrapes, and they'll make longer treks because of that, because they kind of have scrapes intermixed between their bedding areas and where they like to travel, and they will hopscotch between those areas very quickly to go back out and refreshen up their scrapes, so that way all the other deer in the area kind of know that this is my stomping grounds and these are my does and etc. And it's really fascinating to see them go out and seek out those scrapes over
Yeah.
anything else to refreshen them right after a rain.
Good time to target a mature buck, it sounds like.
Yeah, not a bad one.
Have you ever, one final thing I'll mention, and I'll get to Steve's question and we can wrap it up. I also noticed right before a snowfall, when I'm driving, I see deer all out all over the place, right as the first flakes of snow are coming down. Have you observed anything like that? Have you had enough snow events that you're picking up on any of that?
I don't receive a ton of snow events in southern Missouri anymore, but the one time I did this year so far, I was tracking this big mainframe 10. I call him the 10, and he had shed one of his antlers already to that point, and I was continuing to observe him. And I know the long-standing old mythology theory is that cold snaps will cause a buck to drop his antler. The next day, so this is the day before the snow, he traveled around 1.6 to 1.8 miles, and he was going all over the place. He was browsing. He was very, very, very active. Especially just he was out in the woods, kind of in a little bit of diverse habitat, and then spending a ton of time out in a field, a very open field actually, that you can't see it from the roads or anything, but and he was just constantly browsing all day long, which to me suggests that he was sensing a potential change in barometric pressure and he knew there was something coming, so he was preparing for it. It was a very similar thing for a lot of the other deer. They knew something was coming and they were preparing for it. Then whenever the cold snap came in and hit, which I guess it's worth mentioning, the day before the snow, he only traveled like a quarter mile to a half mile that day, which was very consistent for him during this period of time. He was
Right.
hardly traveling long distances. And then this day before the snow, he traveled 1.6 to 1.8 miles all of a sudden.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a dramatic change.
Right.
And then the snow hit, and I found him at 7:30 a.m. bedded down in a clear cut, really tucked up tight, and it was like a blizzard outside, and he had shed his antler that morning.
Mm.
Actually went out and I tracked his tracks from the snow. I had my dog with me, and we found the shed antler from him, and it was pretty cool to kind of confirm those two things that are potentially sensing changes in barometric pressure, and then he went ahead and shed his antler on the cold snap, which is pretty cool.
Pretty, yeah, it is cool. Steve asks, would you ever see mature males bedding down with a group of does, or are they solitary breeders?
Yeah, oftentimes, no, I don't see them bedding with a group of does. I'll see them bedded every once in a while, 50 to 150 yards next to a doe bedding group, but very seldom are they actually bedded inside of that group. Younger bucks will often bed right up against doe bedding areas, and most of the time, I think if you're going into like pre-rut, rut, post-rut, I think that activity is taking place because the mature dominant buck really doesn't want anything to do with the younger bucks, and the younger bucks kind of feel lonely and they don't really know what they're supposed to be doing, so they just kind of latch on to the most mature thing that can guide them throughout the rest of their day, which will be that mature doe group. So they kind of seek them out a little bit more. But mature bucks seem to be pretty solitary type of animals. And another thing is mature bucks are really individualistic characters. I mean, you could have one buck that really tolerates younger buck activity next to him. He could have a younger buck come into him and they could clean each other in the middle of peak rut, and they'll just stand there and lick each other's face for 30 minutes apiece. And it's like, okay. And then another buck in the same exact area, within overlapping home ranges of one another, these two mature bucks, if another deer gets within 5 yards of him, he lowers his head and tries to kill him. They're completely polar opposite animals in that. So they're very individualistic. So, but for the most part, most bucks they're not bedding right inside of with doe bedding groups. No.
Right. Now, when do you see, how about one final one? Because you mentioned like groups of bucks. Have you noticed patterns with bachelor groups and when they start banding back together with larger groups? Because I was seeing some of that happening in December, and I've thought, man, this seems like really early to be bacheloring up again. But
Yeah.
have you noticed anything on that?
Yeah, it seems like most of them end up bacheloring up within the same week time frame. Whenever the first, if the first one started on this day, then within 7 days, most of those groups that are going to group back up, they end up doing so. But then you have some bucks that are interesting in the nature where, like I said, they're very individualistic. And like the very first year that I did research, I had this buck. He was also a big mainframe 10. His name was Winter. That's what I called him in the video.
I've seen
And
your video
he,
on him. Yeah.
yeah, and he all the way throughout January, February, etc., he wouldn't tolerate other deer like 95% of the time. But then every once in a while, he would come back to his group and he would hang out with them. But for the most part, he lived on his own. He didn't like being nearby those other bucks. And then like this last year that I was studying, I've studied him more than any other deer, over 500 hours studied on this the 10 that I'll call him. He had a bachelor group and he bachelored up similar to the same time frame that all the other deer across this area were bacheloring up. There was nothing different in that. But the thing that was different was how he was treating his bachelor group, because these other groups, they seem to be kind of on the same level of one another. No one really thinks they're better than the next guy, and they just kind of they all linger together during bacheloring phase. And there might be a doe that comes into late estrus, which kind of changes things for around a week time frame. But for the most part, they stay together, and they everywhere one of those bucks goes, they all stay together. They never break up. But this one buck that I was researching for over 500 hours, I've struggled to actually properly age him. I think he was 4 years old. There's a chance he was 3. There's also a chance he's like 9. But I really think that he's 4 years old. I don't have any past history.
I love the video where you have these like quips about where we take polls and then you're like dot 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 or up to 9 or something. You had something funny in there. It
Yeah,
was it was great comic relief in your videos. And by the way, I want to put a plug in for anybody here is like Derek's YouTube videos are just high quality material. So definitely recommend going to his channel and checking them out. They're
yeah, I
awesome.
appreciate
So
it. But yeah, this deer, he had a bachelor group that he had clearly chosen to be with and exist with them, but he didn't follow any of the rules. They would go out and browse in a field, and he would go the other direction for a full 12 to 24 hours, and then he would come back and he would reband with them. And that was really interesting to see a buck that he clearly thought of himself as better than the group that he was with. And he knew better than some of the activities that they took place in, like moving out into this exposed field during daylight and maybe traveling over to this. There was an interesting thing I didn't include in the video, was that there was a man-made food plot on my property that his bachelor group would travel out to probably once a week, and he never made that trek. Not once did I see him move over into that area of the property. He always stayed back in this really dense, thick, close to human activity, but didn't expose himself ever. And that his group would go out into that area pretty consistently, which was pretty
okay.
interesting. But moral of the story was that he was notably different, and he thought of himself as being different. He lived a completely different life than his group that he chose to be bachelored up with, which was pretty
Yeah.
cool.
That is cool. Well, Derek, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed learning from you and watching your videos and learning about how all the stuff we're unlocking with this new technology. And I think you're doing great work. Thank you, everybody, for joining up. It was a great conversation, though. We're getting some thank yous. Thanks, Mark. And look forward to having this up on YouTube soon. And thanks for your time. Appreciate it,
Yeah,
Derek. I look forward
yeah,
to staying in touch.
yeah. I appreciate you having me on, Luke. Anytime.
Yeah. All right. You take care.
You too.